The courtroom was dead silent. Not the polite silence of procedure, the silence of shock. A man in a wrinkled coat, shoes held together with duct tape, stood before a family court judge who had just told him he wasn't fit to raise his own daughter. His hands weren't shaking. His voice didn't crack. He looked at the judge the way a man looks at someone standing inside a house he built with his own hands. And he said 6 words that turned that courtroom into a crime scene. "I built that hospital, Your Honor." The judge's face went white. The bailiff stopped moving. The court reporter's fingers froze above her keys. Because what happened next didn't just change the outcome of a custody hearing. It unraveled a lie that had been buried for 3 years, exposed a betrayal worth $2.4 billion, and revealed that the homeless man standing in that courtroom once signed the checks that built half the skyline visible through the judge's own window. But that moment, that satisfying, jaw-dropping moment, means nothing unless you understand who this man was before the world took everything from him, and more importantly, who he became after. So let me take you back. 3 years before that courtroom, a different world entirely. At 6:15 on a Tuesday morning, Daniel Morrow was already on his 4th phone call. He stood on the 52nd floor of Morrow Development Group's headquarters in downtown Chicago, coffee untouched on his desk, watching the sun hit the steel bones of a children's hospital rising from the earth 12 blocks south. His hospital, his design, his money. Daniel didn't inherit wealth. He grew up in Inglewood, south side of Chicago, in a 2-bedroom apartment with a mother who worked double shifts as a janitor and a father who left before Daniel learned to ride a bike. By 22, he'd earned a civil engineering degree on a full scholarship. By 28, he'd flipped his first commercial property. By 35, he owned one of the most respected real estate development firms in the Midwest. By 41, he was a billionaire. But here's the thing about Daniel. Money was never the point. Every project he took, every building he raised, had a purpose. Affordable housing on the west side, a community center in Garfield Park, and now the crown jewel, a state-of-the-art pediatric hospital in a neighborhood where the nearest emergency room was 40 minutes away by bus. He'd funded a third of the construction himself, out of pocket. No tax write-off games, no naming rights deal. He told the board, "Put the community's name on it. They've been waiting long enough." That Tuesday morning, Daniel ended his call and did the same thing he did every morning. He opened the top drawer of his desk, pulled out a photograph, and looked at it. A little girl, maybe 3 years old, laughing on a swing set, her braids flying behind her. Lily, his daughter. He hadn't seen her in 4 months. Her mother, Vanessa, had primary custody after their divorce, and she'd been making visits increasingly difficult. Canceled weekends, unanswered calls. The last time Daniel drove to the house, Vanessa's new boyfriend answered the door and told him Lily was sleeping. It was 2 in the afternoon. Daniel put the photo back. He closed the drawer and walked into a meeting that would destroy his life. His business partner, Craig Winslow, was already seated at the conference table. Craig had been with Daniel since the early days. They'd shaken hands in a parking lot 12 years ago and built an empire from a single condemned property in Pilsen. Craig handled the financial side. Daniel handled vision and construction. It worked. At least Daniel thought it worked. "We need to talk about the lakefront corridor deal," Craig said, sliding a folder across the table. The lakefront corridor was a $700 million mixed-use development, the city's biggest project in a decade. Daniel had spent 2 years securing the contracts, and what Craig showed him that morning was a set of financial documents that made it look like Daniel had been siphoning project funds into offshore accounts. Forged signatures, fabricated wire transfers, shell companies with Daniel's name on incorporation papers he'd never seen. "Where did you get these?" Daniel asked. Craig wouldn't meet his eyes. "The SEC already has copies, Daniel, and so does the Tribune." Here's where the story turns into something the title only hinted at. Because Daniel didn't just lose his company, he didn't just lose his money. What Craig had done, what Daniel wouldn't fully understand for months, was a 3-year orchestrated betrayal designed not just to steal a business, but to erase a man. Craig had been planning this since the day Morrow Development crossed the billion-dollar threshold. So he'd quietly restructured partnerships, redirected contracts through his own subsidiary firms, and built a paper trail so convincing that even Daniel's own attorneys told him the evidence looked damning. Within 72 hours, the SEC froze Morrow Development's assets. Within a week, the story was front page. Daniel Morrow, beloved Chicago developer, philanthropist, the man who built hospitals for children, was now accused of running a fraud scheme that bilked investors out of hundreds of millions. His accounts were frozen, his properties were seized. His board voted unanimously to remove him, with Craig stepping in as interim CEO. Daniel hired a defense attorney, burned through his accessible savings in 3 months of legal fees, filed motions that were delayed, rescheduled, buried. Craig's lawyers were better funded, or they were funded with Daniel's own money. And then Vanessa filed an emergency motion to terminate Daniel's parental rights. The timing wasn't coincidence. Her filing cited the SEC investigation, the asset freezes, and the fact that Daniel could no longer demonstrate financial stability or a suitable living environment for their daughter. By month 6, Daniel Morrow was living in his car. By month 9, the car was repossessed. By month 12, he was sleeping at the Lakeshore Mission on West Madison Street, holding a photograph of a little girl on a swing set, the edges soft from how many times he'd held it. That's where he met Grace. Now, I want you to pause here and think about something. If you were Daniel, if everything you'd built was stolen, if the system you trusted was being used against you, and if the only thing you had left was the fight to stay in your child's life, would you keep going? Or would you start to believe what everybody around you was already saying, that maybe you weren't the man you thought you were? Tell me in the comments. Because the answer to that question is the hinge this entire story swings on. Grace Okafor was a pediatric nurse, 34 years old, born in Lagos, raised in Minneapolis, quiet in the way that people who have seen real suffering are quiet, not withdrawn, observant. She worked the night shift at the very hospital Daniel's company had built, and 3 evenings a week, she volunteered at the Lakeshore Mission serving meals. She noticed Daniel the way you notice something that doesn't fit. He sat in the back corner of the dining hall, away from everyone, and he ate slowly. See, not the way hungry people eat, the way people eat when the meal is the only structure left in their day. And every night, before he finished, he'd take out that photograph and set it next to his tray, like he was making sure someone had a seat at the table. Grace didn't ask him about it, not the first night, not the second. On the third night, she set an extra bread roll on his tray without a word, and he looked up at her with eyes that held something she recognized. Not defeat, refusal, the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the worst thing that happened to him become the truest thing about him. "Thank you," he said. "You look like you could use it," she said. That was all. For weeks, that was all. A bread roll, a nod, a moment of being seen. But slowly, in the margins of those evenings, a conversation started. Grace learned that Daniel had a daughter he was fighting to see. Daniel learned that Grace had lost a younger brother to sickle cell when she was 19, and that his death was the reason she became a nurse. They traded these pieces of themselves carefully, the way people do when they have both learned that vulnerability is expensive. Daniel never told her who he used to be. He didn't mention the company, the buildings, the billions. He was afraid that if she knew, she'd either pity him or not believe him, and he couldn't decide which was worse. Meanwhile, the custody case ground forward like a machine designed to crush him. Daniel had been assigned a public defender, a young woman named Keisha Tran, who was handling 47 cases simultaneously. She was sharp, but she was drowning. Daniel helped her organize his own files, staying up in the mission's common room with a flashlight after hours, building a timeline of Craig's fraud from memory, documenting every visit Vanessa had blocked, every call she'd ignored. Keisha looked at his work one evening and said, "You know, most people in your position would have given up by now." Daniel didn't look up from his papers. "Most people in my position don't have a daughter who still remembers their voice." The first hearing was a disaster. The judge, Honorable Patricia Caldwell, reviewed Daniel's file and saw exactly what anyone would see. A man with no fixed address, no income, no assets, and an active SEC investigation attached to his name. Vanessa's attorney presented a picture of stability, a home, a yard, a fiancé with a steady job. Daniel's request for visitation was denied pending further review. Like he walked out of that courthouse and sat on a bench in the February cold until his fingers went numb. Grace found him that evening at the Mission. She didn't ask what happened. She sat down across from him and said, "Did you eat today?" He shook his head. She made him a plate and sat with him while he ate. And somewhere in that silence, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks or declarations. Just a quiet realignment, like a compass finding north after being spun. He told her everything. The company, the buildings, Craig's betrayal, the billions that were never really the point. He told her about Lily's laugh, how it sounded like someone had bottled joy and cracked it open. He told her he was terrified that by the time he got back to his daughter, she wouldn't remember him at all. Grace listened to every word. And when he was done, she said something that broke him open in a way he didn't expect. "My brother died in a hospital that didn't have the right equipment. I work every night in a hospital that does. Somebody built that. Somebody decided those kids deserve better. If that was you, then the man Lily remembers is still sitting right here," Daniel cried, for the first time in over a year, quietly in the corner of a homeless shelter, while a woman he was falling in love with held his hand across a folding table. The second hearing came 4 months later. Daniel had been working, not in real estate, at a hardware store on Pulaski Road 6 days a week, minimum wage, saving every penny he could. He'd moved into a rented room above a laundromat. It wasn't much. A bed, a hot plate, a window that overlooked an alley, but it had a door that locked and an address he could put on a form. Keisha filed a renewed motion for custody. This time she had more ammunition. A forensic accountant Daniel had connected her with, an old colleague who owed him a favor, had begun unraveling Craig's paper trail. The shell companies traced back to Craig's wife's maiden name. The forged signatures didn't match under digital analysis. The SEC investigation was stalling because the evidence was starting to contradict itself. But none of that had resulted in charges against Craig yet. And in family court, the fraud case was irrelevant. What mattered was right now. What mattered was whether Daniel Morrow could provide for his daughter today. Judge Caldwell read the updated file. She noted the employment. She noted the housing. And then she said the words that landed like a blade. "Mr. Morrow, I appreciate the effort you've demonstrated, but a rented room above a laundromat does not constitute a stable environment for a 6-year-old child. Your income is insufficient to cover childcare, medical needs, or educational expenses. Until your financial and legal circumstances materially change, this court cannot in good conscience award custody or unsupervised visitation." Motion denied. The courtroom started to move on. Papers shuffled. The clerk called the next case number, and Daniel stood up. If this story has you leaning forward right now, if you feel that tension in your chest, that's exactly the kind of story we tell here on Empire Stories TV. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment, because what happens next is the reason this story exists. Daniel stood up, and the room went still, not because he shouted, not because he made a scene, because there was something in the way he rose, slowly, deliberately, like a man who had been carrying a weight so long that the act of straightening his spine was itself a statement. "Your Honor," he said, "may I address the court?" Judge Caldwell looked at him over her glasses. "Mr. Morrow, the ruling has been made. I understand, but with respect, I believe the court is missing information that is directly relevant to this proceeding." Keisha stood beside him, uncertain, but she didn't stop him. Something in his voice told her this was the moment he'd been building toward. "Your Honor, you mentioned that my circumstances don't reflect stability. I understand how it looks. I'm standing here in borrowed shoes. I earn $11.50 an hour. I sleep above a laundromat. By every metric this court uses, I am not enough. He paused. The courtroom was listening now. Even the clerk had stopped shuffling. But I want to ask you something. The Children's Hospital on South Damen Avenue. Mercy Children's Pavilion. Do you know who built it? Judge Caldwell frowned. Mr. Morrow, I don't see the relevance. I built that hospital, Your Honor. Silence. The kind that has weight. My company, Morrow Development Group, designed and constructed that facility. I personally funded 38% of the construction cost. The pediatric ICU, the neonatal wing, the rooftop garden where families sit when they need air because their child is in surgery. I drew the plans for that garden on a napkin at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep knowing kids in that neighborhood were dying in ambulances trying to reach a hospital that was too far away. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn manila envelope. Inside were documents, photographs, architectural renderings with his handwritten notes in the margins. Your Honor, your granddaughter was born in that hospital, November 14th, 3 years ago. I know because my company hosted the ribbon cutting for the new maternity wing 2 weeks before her birth. It was in the Tribune. You were quoted saying it was the finest medical facility you'd ever seen. Judge Caldwell's hand went to the edge of her bench. Her face changed. Not defensiveness, recognition. The slow, a painful recognition that the world is more complicated than the file in front of you. The man who built that hospital, Daniel said, is the same man standing in front of you in duct-taped shoes. The only thing that changed is that my business partner stole everything I had and forged documents to make it look like I was the criminal. The SEC is 6 months from clearing my name, but my daughter is 6 years old right now. She's 6 right now, and she thinks her father forgot about her. His voice broke on that last word. Not dramatically, just a hairline crack that let everything underneath show through. I'm not asking this court to give me anything because of who I used to be. I'm asking you to look at who I still am. I work 6 days a week. I have a home. It's small, but it's clean, and it's mine. And there is someone in my life who can speak to the man I am today, not the man on paper. Keisha stood. Your Honor, we'd like to call a character witness, Grace Okafor. Grace walked into that courtroom in her nursing scrubs. She'd come straight from a 12-hour shift. There were circles under her eyes and her hands still smelled like hospital soap. She took the stand and she told the truth. She told the court about the man she'd watched sit alone in a shelter every night for months, holding a photograph of his daughter like it was the deed to everything he owned. She told them about the bread rolls and the quiet conversations, and the night he finally told her his story, not to impress her, but because he was drowning and she was the only person who'd bothered to ask if he could swim. She told them she'd looked up his claims, and everyone. The hospital was real. The community centers were real. The affordable housing was real. And the SEC case was unraveling because the fraud was never his. And then she said something that the judge would later tell a colleague she never forgot. Your Honor, I fell in love with this man when he had nothing. Not a dollar, not a reputation, not a single reason for me to believe him, except the way he talked about his daughter. A man who loves his child like that, who fights like that when the whole world says stop, that man doesn't need a bigger apartment to be a father. He already is one. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the heating vent rattling in the ceiling. Judge Caldwell removed her glasses. She set them on the bench. She looked at Daniel for a long time, and then she looked at Grace. The court will take a 30-minute recess, she said. When we return, I'd like to review the documentation Mr. Morrow has submitted, and I want both attorneys in my chambers. 45 minutes later, Judge Caldwell issued a revised ruling. Supervised visitation 3 days a week, pending a full review of the SEC case and an updated home study. It was in custody, it wasn't the end, but it was a door cracked open where before there had been a wall. Daniel walked out of that courthouse into the March sun with Grace beside him. He didn't say anything for a full block. Then he stopped walking, turned to her, and said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said, "because someone did it for me once. Someone built a hospital so kids like my brother would have a chance. I didn't know it was you then, but I know it now. 7 months later, the SEC formally dropped all charges against Daniel Morrow and filed a 63-count indictment against Craig Winslow. The forged documents were exposed. The stolen assets were traced. The empire Daniel had built was in ruins, but the ruins belonged to him again. He didn't rebuild the company, not right away. He moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park, near Grace's place, and he painted the smaller bedroom lavender because Lily once told him it was the color of magic. Lily moved in on a Saturday in October. She ran through the front door, saw her room, and crashed into Daniel's arms so hard he stumbled backward into the wall. "Daddy," she said, "I knew you'd come back." He held her and he cried, and this time he didn't try to be quiet about it. Grace was there, standing in the doorway, watching a man she'd fed bread, rolls to in a homeless shelter, hold his daughter in a room painted the color of magic, and she thought about her brother in the hospital and the strange way the world sometimes takes everything from you just to show you what was yours all along. Daniel and Grace married the following spring. Small ceremony, the mission's courtyard. The shelter director officiated. Half the guests were residents Daniel had shared meals with during the worst year of his life. Lily was the flower girl. She threw the petals too hard and they hit the groom in the face, and everyone laughed. And it was the most beautiful sound Daniel had ever heard, second only to his daughter's voice calling him daddy like she'd never stopped. Here's what I want you to carry with you after this story. Daniel Morrow didn't win because he revealed he was a billionaire. He won because he refused to let the worst chapter of his life be the last one. He won because he showed up every single day to a fight that the odds said he should lose. And he did it in duct-taped shoes and borrowed coats and with hands that shook when he thought no one was watching. And Grace. Grace didn't fall in love with a building or a bank account. She fell in love with a man who sat alone in a shelter, holding a photograph like a prayer. She saw him before the world remembered who he was. And that, the act of seeing someone when they are invisible, might be the most powerful thing one person can do for another. You don't have to build a hospital to matter. You don't have to be a billionaire to deserve love or a second chance. You just have to keep showing up. Even when the judge says no, even when the world says you're nothing, especially then. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear that their worst moment doesn't get to write their ending. And if you want another story that will grab you by the chest and not let go, watch the one on screen right now. It's about a janitor who showed up to a billionaire's funeral, and what happened when they read the will changed every life in that room. I'll see you there.